Throughout the 1950s, Dean Acheson was the most hated man in America. His name was synonymous with the loss of China and the bloodshed in Korea. Yet, in the halls of power, he was revered as the most capable Secretary of State in history. He was the brilliant mind who designed the world order we live in today. So, how did the architect of the West become public enemy number one? It turns out the very brilliance he used to build the world became the weapon that destroyed his reputation. It was his upbringing and aristocratic lineage that molded Dean Acheson's towering ego. Born in 1893 in Connecticut, he grew up in a world of privilege, with a father who was an Episcopal bishop and a mother descended from the famed Gooderham whiskey dynasty. In his youth, Acheson used his sharp intellect to mock authority rather than serve it. At Yale, he was the ultimate socialite, downing champagne and wasting days with his best friend, the musician Cole Porter. It was only when he stepped into the gladiator arena of Harvard Law School that his attitude truly shifted. Under the mentorship of Felix Frankfurter and Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, the lazy socialite transformed into a cold, rigorous legal mind. He internalized a brutal lesson. Don't tell me what is fair, tell me what the facts are. That brutal commitment to facts was tested immediately in 1933. When President Roosevelt ordered the devaluation of the dollar to save the economy, Acheson flatly refused, arguing it was illegal. He chose a humiliating public firing over bending the law. That moment revealed the true Dean Acheson, a stubborn, arrogant man, but one possessing an integrity that power could not buy. For 7 long years, Dean Acheson lived in the political wilderness. To the casual observer, he had everything: a thriving law practice, a Georgetown home, and a full social calendar. But beneath the veneer lay a restless energy. Having tasted power only to lose it, he remained haunted by his solitary stand against the immensely popular Franklin Roosevelt. While arguing cases for oil companies, Acheson watched with growing horror as the world darkened. The 1930s were not kind to optimists, with Hitler screaming from podiums and Japan carving a path of destruction. Acheson saw what most Americans refused to see. The Atlantic and Pacific were no longer moats protecting the United States. While the mood in America was stubbornly isolationist, with millions of citizens believing that the problems of Europe were none of their business, Acheson began to speak out. He realized that if Britain and France fell, the United States would be left alone in a world dominated by totalitarian giants. He joined the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies, a group dedicated to waking the sleeping giant. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was becoming a prophet of intervention. He argued that the only way to avoid war was to project power, but his voice was often drowned out by the chorus of America First. Then came the fall of France in June 1940. It was a shock that shattered the world's complacency. The Nazi war machine had rolled through Paris in weeks. Suddenly, Great Britain stood alone, a small island shielding the flame of democracy against a continent of darkness. In Washington, the mood shifted from denial to panic. President Roosevelt knew he needed the best men he could find, regardless of past grudges. He needed men who understood the mechanics of the world. And so, he swallowed his pride. In 1941, the call came back to the townhouse in Georgetown. Dean Acheson was asked to return to the government, this time as Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs. It was a remarkable reconciliation. When Acheson walked back into the Oval Office years after his defiant resignation, he expected a lecture. Instead, FDR simply flashed that famous, charming smile and put him to work. There was no time for apologies. The world was on fire. Acheson's new role was less about diplomacy in the traditional sense and more about economic warfare. He became the master of the gears and levers that moved supplies across the oceans. He was one of the key legal architects of the Lend-Lease program, the lifeline that sent American destroyers, tanks, and food to a starving Britain. While Churchill gave the speeches that rallied the spirit, Acheson and his team found the legal loopholes to bypass the Neutrality Acts and send the guns. He was fighting a war with contracts and cargo manifests, turning the American economy into the arsenal of democracy. But his most consequential act during this period came in the summer of 1941. Japan was expanding aggressively in the Pacific, fueled by American oil. The United States faced a choice: continue feeding the tiger or cut off the food supply and risk being bitten. Acheson was a hawk. He believed that appeasement only invited aggression. When the order came to freeze Japanese assets in the United States, Acheson interpreted the order with a rigorous severity that surprised even the president. He effectively imposed a total oil embargo on Japan. It was a move that strangled the Japanese military machine. Historians still debate whether this decision forced Japan's hand, leading directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor just a few months later. But Acheson's logic was clear. You cannot claim to oppose tyranny while fueling its tanks. When the bombs fell on Hawaii on December 7, 1941, the debate ended. Acheson's war had gone from economic to total. Throughout the war, while the generals plotted the invasions of North Africa and Normandy, Dean Acheson was fighting a different kind of battle. He was looking at the future. He looked at the wreckage of the 1930s, the trade wars, the hyperinflation, the competitive devaluations. And he realized that the war had been caused as much by economics as by ideology. If the world went back to the economic chaos of the pre-war years, a third world war was inevitable. He became obsessed with the idea of structure. He believed the world needed institutions, rules, and a policeman. He began to envision a post-war order where nations were tied together by commerce so tightly that war would become bad business. This vision culminated in July 1944 at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. While nominally a gathering of 44 nations, it was actually a coronation. The British Empire was bankrupt, while the Americans held all the gold. Acheson's role wasn't just diplomacy. It was to engineer a transfer of global power. He ensured the new world economy was built on the US dollar, effectively ending Britain's financial dominance. The atmosphere at Bretton Woods was intense. With Allied armies closing in on Berlin, delegates from 44 nations gathered not just to talk, but to decide the shape of the peace. To push the agreement through, Acheson deployed his full arsenal, drinking with the Russians, arguing with the British, and charming the press. The result was the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, pillars of a new global civilization, with the dollar as its bedrock. Acheson was ensuring that when the smoke cleared, America would own the table. As the war in Europe ground to a halt in May 1945, Acheson stood at the pinnacle of his influence. But the victory was bittersweet. President Roosevelt, the man who had fired him and then rehired him, the man who had cast a shadow over the entire era, was dead. Harry S. Truman was now president. Acheson barely knew Truman. To the polished Yale lawyer, Truman seemed like a provincial accident, a failed haberdasher from Missouri with thick glasses and a flat Midwestern accent. Acheson, like many in the Washington elite, underestimated him. He expected a caretaker presidency. He had no idea that he was about to form the most significant political partnership of his life. The war ended, but the peace did not begin. The Soviet Union, once a heroic ally against Hitler, was beginning to look like a new predator. Stalin's armies were not leaving Eastern Europe. They were installing puppet governments in Poland, Hungary, and Romania. The joy of VE Day evaporated almost instantly, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Dean Acheson, now Undersecretary of State, found himself standing on the fault line of a new epoch. He watched as the Soviet Union pressed demands on Turkey and delayed withdrawal from Iran. He saw the exhausted British Empire crumbling, unable to maintain its colonial obligations. It was in this vacuum, between the death of the old European powers and the rise of the Soviet giant, that Dean Acheson realized the terrifying truth. There was no one else left. The United States could not go home. If America stepped back, the Soviet Union would step in. The gentleman from Connecticut looked at the map, and for the first time, he saw the Iron Curtain descending. He realized that the task of building the world was not finished at Bretton Woods. It was only just beginning. He would have to teach the American people who were desperate for normalcy that they were now the guardians of the gate, and to do that, he would have to scare them to death. To the sophisticated elites of the State Department, Truman was a joke, a machine politician from the Pendergast organization in Missouri, a man who wore double-breasted suits that were a little too loud and spoke with a twang that lacked any hint of Ivy League polish. Dean Acheson, the consummate Yale man, the embodiment of Eastern establishment grace, looked at his new boss with deep skepticism. They were, on the surface, the oddest couple in American history. One was whiskey and poker, the other was sherry and skepticism. One was the son of a mule trader, the other was the son of a bishop. But history is forged in the chemistry between men, and something unexpected happened between the rough-hewn president and his aristocratic undersecretary. Acheson discovered that beneath Truman's provincial exterior lay a spine of steel and a profound humility. Truman, unlike Roosevelt, did not think he was a god. He knew what he didn't know. He craved facts, he respected competence, and he valued loyalty above all else. Acheson, who had been fired for being too rigid with Roosevelt, found in Truman a man who wanted the unvarnished truth. A bond formed between them, a relationship of absolute trust that would become the bedrock of Western foreign policy. Acheson became Truman's teacher, his defender, and his grand strategist. They would need every ounce of that bond, because the peace they had celebrated in 1945 was rapidly turning into a nightmare. The first test was the atom. The United States possessed the most terrifying weapon in human history, and the monopoly was making the world nervous. In 1946, Acheson was still clinging to the hope of a cooperative world. He was not yet the cold warrior of legend. In fact, he was tasked with chairing a committee to draft a plan for the international control of atomic energy. Working with David Lilienthal, the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, Acheson spent weeks in an intense intellectual sprint, trying to design a system where the secrets of the atom could be shared with the Soviet Union and the world under strict United Nations supervision, preventing an arms race before it began. It was a noble, desperate attempt at sanity. The resulting Acheson-Lilienthal report was a masterpiece of optimistic statecraft. But when the plan was presented to the Soviets, it was met with stonewalling and suspicion. Stalin wasn't interested in international inspections. He was interested in building his own bomb. Acheson watched the negotiations crumble. He watched the Soviet ambassador, Andrei Gromyko, veto every substantive proposal at the UN. It was a turning point in Acheson's psychology. He realized that you could not treat the Soviet Union like a normal country. They were not interested in stability. They were interested in advantage. The lawyer in Acheson, the man who believed in contracts and agreements, began to recede, and the strategist began to emerge. He realized that diplomacy with Moscow was not a negotiation. It was a contest of pressure. The year 1946 ground on bleak and hungry. Europe was not recovering. It was rotting. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was the worst in living memory. Blizzards buried London and Berlin. Coal shortages meant that millions of Europeans were freezing in unheated ruins. In this misery, the communist parties of France and Italy were growing stronger by the day, promising bread and heat where capitalism seemed to offer only cold and starvation. Acheson sat in the State Department, reading the cables with mounting dread. He saw the pattern. The Soviets were pressing on the weak points. They were demanding territory from Turkey. They were fueling a civil war in Greece where communist guerrillas were fighting the royalist government. Then came the weekend that changed the world. Friday, February 21st, 1947. Late in the afternoon, a messenger from the British Embassy arrived at the State Department. He carried 2 official notes, blue papers, for the Secretary of State, George Marshall. Marshall was away for the weekend, so the papers landed on Dean Acheson's desk. Acheson read them, and he knew instantly that the 19th century was officially over. The notes were a confession of bankruptcy. The British government, the colossus that had policed the globe for 200 years, was broken. They had spent their blood and treasure fighting Hitler, and the cupboard was bare. The notes informed the United States that in 6 weeks, by March 31st, Britain would no longer be able to provide financial or military support to Greece and Turkey. They were pulling out. They were handing the keys of the world to Washington. Acheson understood the gravity of the moment immediately. If Britain left, a vacuum would open up in the Eastern Mediterranean. And physics, like geopolitics, abhors a vacuum. The Soviets would rush in. If Greece fell to communism, Turkey would be surrounded. If Turkey fell, the Soviet Union would control the Bosphorus and have a clear path to the oil fields of the Middle East. It would be a geopolitical catastrophe that could turn the Cold War into a rout. Acheson spent a feverish weekend drafting the American response. He had to convince President Truman, the Congress, and the American people to do something they had never done before: intervene in a conflict thousands of miles away in peacetime, with no direct attack on American soil. On February 27, 1947, a crucial meeting was held in the White House. President Truman summoned the congressional leadership, including the powerful Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg. The administration needed money, $400 million, for Greece and Turkey. Secretary of State George Marshall, a soldier of few words, spoke first. He gave a dry military analysis of the situation, focusing on logistics and maps. The mood in the room was flat. The congressmen were skeptical. Why should American taxpayers pour money into a corrupt Greek government? Why was this America's problem? Acheson saw the meeting slipping away. He leaned over to Marshall and whispered, "General, is it all right if I speak?" Marshall nodded. Dean Acheson stood up. He didn't talk about logistics. He didn't talk about budgets. He talked about the apocalypse. He looked the senators in the eye and unleashed one of the most powerful extemporaneous speeches in American history. He painted a picture of the world divided between 2 ways of life: freedom and coercion. He used a metaphor that would haunt American policy for decades: the rotten apple. He argued that if Greece and Turkey were allowed to rot, the infection would spread. It would spread to Iran, to India, to Africa. The Iron Curtain would close around Europe, and the United States would be left alone in a fortress, besieged by a hostile world. "We have arrived," Acheson declared, "at a situation which has not existed since Rome and Carthage. There is no other power left to hold the line." The room went silent. The sheer scale of the vision, the terrifying clarity of it, stunned the politicians. Senator Vandenberg, a staunch isolationist, looked at Acheson and said, "Mr. Secretary, if you want to get this, you're going to have to go before the country and scare the hell out of the American people." They had their mandate. Acheson went to work drafting the speech that Truman would deliver to Congress. He stripped away the nuance. He made it a binary choice between light and darkness. On March 12, 1947, Truman stood before a joint session of Congress and enunciated the Truman Doctrine. "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." It was a declaration of global responsibility. The United States was no longer a republic minding its own business. It was the global policeman. Acheson had written the job description, but Acheson knew that military aid to Greece and Turkey was just a bandage. The patient, Europe itself, was dying. The economies of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy were in a death spiral. People were starving. Currencies were worthless. Acheson understood that you couldn't fight communism with guns alone. You had to fight it with bread. If capitalism couldn't put food on the table, the people would choose communism. Working feverishly in the spring of 1947, Acheson and his team, men like George Kennan and Will Clayton, began to sketch out a plan for massive economic recovery. It was audacious. They proposed that the United States should simply give billions of dollars to Europe to help them rebuild their factories and farms. It was the largest foreign aid program in history. There was a political problem, however. If they called it the Acheson Plan, it would die. Acheson was already viewed with suspicion by some Republicans as too intellectual, too internationalist. But George Marshall, the architect of victory in World War II, Marshall was a saint. He was untouchable. Acheson, in a supreme act of ego suppression, insisted that the plan bear Marshall's name. He wrote the speech that Marshall would deliver at Harvard University in June 1947. He choreographed the rollout. He worked the back rooms of Congress, twisting arms and cashing in favors to get the funding approved. When the Marshall Plan passed, it funneled over $13 billion into Western Europe. It was a miracle of logistics and generosity. It rebuilt the railroads of France, the steel mills of Germany, and the ports of the Netherlands. It broke the fever of communism in Western Europe. It was the greatest diplomatic achievement of the 20th century. Dean Acheson stood in the background as the accolades poured in for Marshall. He didn't care about the credit. He cared about the result. He had secured the western flank. But he knew, with the instinct of a man who watches the horizon, that the storm was not over. The focus was about to shift. While he had been shoring up the walls of Europe, the dam was breaking in Asia, and the chaos that was about to be unleashed in China would not only threaten the world order he was building, but it would come for him personally with a knife in its hand. By the summer of 1948, Dean Acheson was technically a civilian again. He had resigned as Undersecretary of State to return to his law practice, needing to replenish his bank account after years of government service. He watched from the sidelines as Harry Truman fought for his political life. The 1948 presidential election was supposed to be a funeral procession for the Democrats. The Republicans, led by the polished Thomas Dewey, were measuring the drapes in the White House. The newspapers had already written Truman's political obituary, but Acheson, observing from his townhouse in Georgetown, saw something the pundits missed. He saw the grit. While the intellectuals mocked Truman, the president was out on the back of a train, crisscrossing the heartland, giving them hell. When Truman pulled off the greatest upset in American political history that November, Acheson was thrilled. He sent a telegram to the president. "You have done it. You have shown them all." A few weeks later, the phone rang. Truman didn't just want congratulations, he wanted a partner. He offered Acheson the greatest prize in American diplomacy, the Secretary of State. On January 21, 1949, Dean Acheson was sworn in as the 51st Secretary of State. He was 55 years old at the peak of his intellectual powers. He looked the part, tall, imperious, impeccable. But as he took the oath, standing next to the beaming president, neither man knew they were walking into a buzzsaw. 1949 would not be a victory lap. It would be the year the world broke in two. It would be the year of the shocks, a cascade of disasters that would traumatize the American psyche and turn Dean Acheson from a respected statesman into a hunted man. But before the nightmare began, there was one final moment of glory, one last act of creation. Acheson's primary obsession remained Europe. The Marshall Plan was pouring concrete and steel into the continent's economy, but money wasn't enough. The Europeans were terrified. They looked at the Red Army stationed in East Germany, millions of men strong, and they looked at their own hollowed-out militaries, and they felt naked. Economic aid could build factories, but it couldn't stop tanks. Acheson understood that for the West to survive, it needed a shield. He needed to do something that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had explicitly warned against. He needed to entangle the United States in a permanent military alliance with Europe. The negotiations for the North Atlantic Treaty were a masterclass in diplomacy. Acheson had to soothe the anxieties of the French, who were terrified of rearming Germany. He had to reassure the Scandinavians, who feared provoking the Soviets. And hardest of all, he had to convince the U.S. Senate to ratify a treaty that said an attack on Paris was legally the same as an attack on New York. He worked 18-hour days. He met with senators in private clubs, patiently explaining the new reality. He didn't use the language of crusade, he used the language of insurance. "We are buying peace," he argued, "and the premium is cheaper than a Third World War." On April 4, 1949, in the Departmental Auditorium in Washington, D.C., the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. The Marine Band played Gershwin. The atmosphere was electric. As Acheson signed the document creating NATO, he knew he was altering the genetic code of American foreign policy. For the first time in history, the Atlantic Ocean was not a barrier, but a bridge. The West was now a single political and military unit. It was the crowning achievement of his life. In his memoirs, he would later reflect on this moment with a rare flash of pride, noting that the alliance was the steel skeleton that would hold the free world upright. If the movie ended there, with the ink drying on the NATO treaty and the flashbulbs popping, it would be a happy ending. But history is relentless. Just as Acheson was securing the front door in Europe, the back door in Asia was being kicked in. For years, China had been bleeding. The civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists had been grinding on since the 1920s, paused only by the Japanese invasion. The United States had backed Chiang Kai-shek. They had sent him billions of dollars, mountains of weapons, and armies of advisors. But Chiang's government was a rotting structure, corrupt, inefficient, and disconnected from the peasantry. His generals sold their American weapons to the enemy. His soldiers defected in droves. Acheson looked at China with the cold, unsentimental eye of a bankruptcy lawyer. He saw a bad investment. He realized that no amount of American money could save a regime that had lost the will to fight. When the China lobby, a powerful group of Republicans and missionaries who idolized Chiang, demanded more aid, Acheson said no. He argued that the United States could not want victory more than the Chinese nationalists themselves. "We are not in the business of buying loyalty," he told the president. "We are in the business of supporting viable allies, and Chiang is not viable." It was the correct analysis factually, but politically, it was suicide. Throughout the summer of 1949, the news from China grew worse. The Communist Army swept south, crossing the Yangtze River with ease. Cities fell like dominoes: Nanjing, Shanghai, Canton. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The most populous nation on earth had turned red. The shock in America was seismic. The public could not understand it. How could we win World War II and then lose China 4 years later? Who was responsible? The narrative began to take hold that this wasn't a military defeat, but a betrayal. Someone in Washington must have opened the gates from the inside. Acheson tried to fight the hysteria with logic, always his fatal flaw. He ordered the State Department to compile a massive historical record of U.S. relations with China, proving that the administration had done everything possible to save Chiang. This document, known as the China White Paper, was over 1,000 pages long. It was thorough, honest, and devastatingly critical of Chiang Kai-shek. Acheson published it in August 1949, believing that the truth would set him free. He wrote in the introduction, "The unfortunate but inescapable fact is that the ominous result of the Civil War in China was beyond the control of the government of the United States. Nothing that this country did or could have done within the reasonable limits of its capabilities could have changed the result." He expected the public to read it and say, "Ah, I see. It wasn't our fault." Instead, the white paper was like pouring gasoline on a fire. To the Republicans, it looked like Acheson was stabbing a fallen ally in the back. It looked like an apology for Mao. Senator Styles Bridges called it a 1,054-page whitewash of a wishful do-nothing policy. The press screamed that Acheson was washing his hands of democracy. They didn't want explanations, they wanted a scapegoat. And Acheson, with his British clothes and his intellectual arrogance, was the perfect villain. But the shocks of 1949 were ruthless. In September, the Soviets detonated their own atomic bomb, shattering America's nuclear monopoly 5 years early. Panic swept Washington. Faced with this existential threat, Acheson was forced to authorize the hydrogen bomb, accepting the grim logic of mutually assured destruction. He was exhausted, believing he had faced the worst. He was wrong. The real attack wasn't coming from Moscow, but from a junior senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. The stage was set for the Great Fear. The public was terrified, angry, and looking for traitors. They looked at the State Department, full of Ivy League intellectuals who spoke foreign languages and understood the nuances of Marxism. They looked at Dean Acheson, the man who had lost China. And in the shadows waiting for his moment was Joseph McCarthy. He had a briefcase, a bottle of whiskey, and a piece of paper that he claimed contained a list of names. The storm that was about to break over Dean Acheson's head would make the political battles of the past look like a gentleman's disagreement. The architect of the West was about to become the enemy of the people. The year 1950 began not with a whimper, but with a moral explosion. On January 21st, the exact day Dean Acheson completed his first year as Secretary of State, a jury in New York delivered its verdict in the trial of the century. Alger Hiss, the former State Department golden boy, the man who had stood by Roosevelt at Yalta and helped draft the UN Charter, was found guilty of perjury. Implicit in the verdict was the damning conclusion that Hiss had been a Soviet spy. For the American public, this was the final proof that the government was rotten. If a man as polished and pedigreed as Alger Hiss could be a traitor, then who could be trusted? 4 days later, Dean Acheson held a press conference. The room was packed. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and hostility. The reporters weren't there to ask about treaties or trade tariffs. They were there to see if the Secretary of State would disavow his friend. Every political instinct, every advisor, every shred of common sense screamed that Acheson should denounce Hiss. He should call him a traitor. He should distance himself as far as possible to save his own skin and the credibility of the Truman administration. But Dean Acheson was not a politician. He was a man of a peculiar, almost archaic code of honor. When the question was asked, "Mr. Secretary, do you have any comment on the Hiss case?" Acheson looked over the sea of reporters with a steady, unblinking gaze. He did not read from a prepared statement. He spoke from the heart. "I should like to make it clear to you," he said, his voice calm and defiant, "that whatever the outcome of any appeal which Mr. Hiss or his lawyers may take in this case, I do not intend to turn my back on Alger Hiss." He went on to cite the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, about the duty of a Christian to visit the imprisoned and comfort the fallen. To Acheson, this was an act of personal grace, a refusal to kick a man when he was down. He wasn't endorsing espionage. He was endorsing loyalty to a friend in disgrace. But to the American public terrified of atomic bombs and communist infiltration, it sounded like a confession. It sounded like the Secretary of State was saying, "I choose my spy friend over the security of my country." The reaction was nuclear. The headline screamed, "Acheson defends Hiss." Senator Joseph McCarthy, who had been looking for an issue to ignite his lackluster career, saw his opening. 2 weeks later, in Wheeling, West Virginia, McCarthy held up a piece of paper and claimed he had a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. He didn't just attack the department. He attacked Acheson personally. He called him the Red Dean. He mocked his striped pants and his phony British accent. He painted a picture of a college of cowardly communist containment, led by a man who cared more for the opinions of London society than the safety of Wisconsin farmers. For the next 6 months, Acheson lived in a hurricane. He was burned in effigy. Letters poured into the State Department demanding his resignation, filled with vitriol and threats. Republican leaders in Congress boycotted briefings. Richard Nixon called him a traitor to the high principles of his office. Through it all, Acheson maintained a facade of icy indifference. He referred to his attackers in his memoirs as the primitives, men who were too stupid to understand the complexities of the world, savages attacking civilization. But friends noticed that the sparkle in his eyes was dimming. The stress was immense. He was trying to manage the Cold War while being treated like a criminal in his own capital. And in the midst of this domestic political slaughter, Acheson made a mistake, a strategic error that would haunt him forever. On January 12, 1950, he gave a speech at the National Press Club. It was intended to be a sober, realistic assessment of American power in the Pacific. He pulled out a map and drew the United States' defensive perimeter. He drew the line from the Aleutian Islands to Japan, down to the Ryukyus, and to the Philippines. These were the areas the U.S. would fight to defend. But he left something out: South Korea. Acheson didn't mean that the U.S. would abandon Korea. He meant that the U.S. wouldn't guarantee it with a unilateral military commitment. It was a nuanced distinction. But dictators do not deal in nuance. In Pyongyang, the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung read the speech. In Moscow, Stalin read the speech. They saw a green light. They concluded that if they attacked the South, the Americans would stay home. On Sunday, June 25, 1950, the phone rang, at Acheson's farm in Maryland. It was the State Department duty officer. "Mr. Secretary," the voice said, "North Korean forces have crossed the 38th parallel in force. It looks like a full-scale invasion." The Cold War had just turned hot. Acheson didn't hesitate. The Red Dean, the alleged appeaser, the man who supposedly loved communists, became instantly the most hawkish man in Washington. He knew that this wasn't just a civil war in a small Asian peninsula. This was a test. If the United States let South Korea fall, every ally in Europe would panic. They would think NATO was a paper tiger. The entire structure he had built, the architecture of the West, would collapse. He drove to Washington, his mind racing. He called President Truman, who was visiting his family in Independence, Missouri. "Mr. President," Acheson said, "you have to come back." For the next 5 days, Acheson was the acting commander-in-chief in all but name. Moving with frantic precision, he drafted resolutions for the United Nations and coordinated logistics with a hesitant military. When Truman finally arrived at Blair House, Acheson cut through the fog of confusion. While political advisors worried about the Soviets, he argued that the U.S. had to draw a line in the sand. Truman agreed, ordering air and naval support. The United States was at war. Ironically, the war saved Acheson's job, at least temporarily. You don't fire the Secretary of State when the troops are landing. But the war also brought a new, terrifying dynamic. The early weeks of the Korean War were a disaster. American troops, saw from occupation duty in Japan, were overrun by the battle-hardened North Koreans. They were pushed back mile by bloody mile to the Pusan perimeter at the tip of the peninsula. Throughout that sweltering summer of 1950, Acheson worked 18-hour days. He was managing a global coalition. He was keeping the British and the French from panicking, assuring them that the war in Korea wouldn't leave Europe undefended. He was the calm center of the storm. Then came the miracle. In September, General Douglas MacArthur launched the daring amphibious landing at Incheon. It was a masterstroke. The North Korean army was flanked and destroyed. American troops broke out of Pusan and raced north. Seoul was liberated. The enemy was shattered. Suddenly, the war seemed won. The North Koreans were retreating back across the 38th parallel. Victory was in sight. And here, in the flush of victory, the fatal hubris set in. The question on the table changed. It was no longer, how do we save South Korea? It became, should we conquer North Korea? Acheson was wary. He knew that China had warned the U.S. not to approach its border at the Yalu River. He saw the intelligence reports. But the pressure was overwhelming. The public wanted a total victory. The Republicans were screaming that stopping at the 38th parallel would be appeasement. General MacArthur, confident in his intelligence reports, assured the administration that Chinese intervention was unlikely. He famously predicted that if they did try, it would result in the greatest slaughter in history. Acheson hesitated. His instincts told him to be careful, but he didn't want to be seen as the man holding back the military. He didn't want to give McCarthy more ammunition. So, against his better judgment, he gave the diplomatic green light. He authorized the crossing of the 38th parallel. He allowed the armies to march north toward the Yalu, toward the mysterious frozen mountains where the Chinese armies were waiting in the snow. He had survived the Hiss case. He had survived the outbreak of war, but Dean Acheson was about to walk into the greatest trap of his life. The Red Dean was about to be blamed for a catastrophe that would make the previous struggles look like child's play. He thought he had seen the worst of the primitives. He was wrong. The real nightmare was just beginning. November 1950 was colder than anyone could remember. In the rugged, wind-blasted mountains of North Korea, the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. American soldiers, confident in General MacArthur's promise that the war was over and they would be home by Christmas, were spread thin, racing toward the Yalu River. In Washington, the mood was cautiously triumphant. The midterm elections had just passed, and while the Democrats took a beating, the administration felt the worst of the foreign crisis was over. Dean Acheson allowed himself a moment to breathe. He had navigated the treacherous waters of intervention, and it seemed the gamble had paid off. Then, the trap snapped shut. On the night of November 25th, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, wearing quilted cotton uniforms and moving like ghosts through the snow, emerged from the darkness. They slammed into the American lines with the force of a tidal wave. The bugles blew, the mortars rained down, and the United States Army suffered the worst defeat in its history. The retreat from the Acheson Reservoir was a frozen hell. The victory march turned into a desperate scramble for survival. In Washington, the news arrived like a physical blow. Acheson received the cables at the State Department, and for the first time, his composure cracked. It wasn't just an intelligence failure, it was a failure of judgment. Acheson had dismissed the frantic diplomatic warnings channeled through the Indian ambassador, believing Mao was bluffing. He had bet American lives on his ability to read the enemy, and he had been wrong. The Chinese had not only intervened, they were pushing the most powerful army on Earth into the sea. The specter of World War III, the very thing Acheson had spent 5 years trying to prevent, was suddenly standing in the room. If the United States struck back at China directly, the Soviet Union might move in Europe. The world was balancing on a razor's edge. The weeks that followed were the darkest of the Truman presidency. The public reaction was a mixture of terror and fury, and the fury found its target. The parents of the boys freezing in Korea didn't blame MacArthur, the general who had marched them into the trap. They blamed Dean Acheson. They blamed the diplomat in striped pants who had tied the general's hands. They blamed the man who had supposedly lost China in the first place. Letters flooded Acheson's office. They were brutal. "You are the murderer of my son," one mother wrote. "I hope you burn in hell for what you have done to our boys." Acheson read them. He kept them in his desk. Outwardly, he remained the stoic, arrogant aristocrat, brushing off questions with a sneer. But privately, he was tormented. He was a father himself. His son David was in the Navy. He felt the weight of every casualty, but he knew that he could not show weakness. If he panicked, the alliance would panic. The crisis deepened in December 1950. General MacArthur, his ego bruised by the Chinese counterattack, began to demand a widening of the war. He wanted to bomb Chinese cities. He wanted to unleash Chiang Kai-shek's forces from Taiwan. He hinted at using atomic weapons. He publicly declared that there was no substitute for victory. Acheson looked at the map and saw madness. He understood what MacArthur did not. The enemy was not just China. The enemy was the Soviet Union. If the U.S. committed its entire military strength to a land war in Asia, the Kremlin would simply walk into West Berlin. Acheson argued fiercely in the Situation Room. "We are fighting the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy," General Omar Bradley later said, echoing Acheson's logic. The goal was not to conquer China. The goal was to hold the line and prevent a global apocalypse. The tension between the White House and the general reached a breaking point in the spring of 1951. MacArthur was actively sabotaging the president's attempts to negotiate a ceasefire. He wrote a letter to a Republican congressman openly criticizing the administration's policy of limited war. It was insubordination, plain and simple. President Truman had had enough. On April 6, 1951, he summoned Acheson, Marshall, and Bradley. "I'm going to fire the son of a bitch," Truman said. Acheson, the lawyer, urged caution. He knew that firing Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific, a living legend, would be politically radioactive. He warned Truman that the administration would be crucified. "If you do this," Acheson said, "you will face the greatest storm in political history." But he also agreed that it had to be done. The Constitution was at stake. The military had to be subordinate to civilian control. On April 11, 1951, Truman fired MacArthur. The explosion was instantaneous. The American public went berserk. MacArthur returned to the United States to a hero's welcome. Ticker tape parades in New York and Washington drew millions of cheering fans. He addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech, leaving half the chamber in tears. Meanwhile, Dean Acheson was burned in effigy in cities across America. Signs read, "Impeach the Red Dean." The Republicans in Congress introduced motions to remove him from office. He was called a traitor, a coward, and a Stalinist agent. He could not walk down the street without a security detail. He was the most hated man in the country. But this was also Dean Acheson's finest hour. The Senate initiated hearings on the firing of MacArthur and the situation in the Far East. It was intended to be a show trial, a public execution of the Truman administration's foreign policy. MacArthur testified first, offering sweeping, simplistic rhetoric about victory. Then it was Acheson's turn. For 8 days, Dean Acheson sat in the witness chair. He faced a hostile panel of senators who wanted his blood. But something remarkable happened. Acheson didn't buckle. He didn't get angry. He didn't use rhetoric. He used facts. He had prepared for weeks. He knew every cable, every date, every troop movement. When the senators asked why he wouldn't bomb China, he patiently explained the Soviet Mutual Defense Treaty. When they asked why he wouldn't unleash Chiang Kai-shek, he explained the logistical impossibility of an invasion. He lectured them on the delicate balance of the NATO alliance. He effectively taught a seminar on geopolitics to the United States Senate. Hour by hour, day by day, the steam went out of the inquiry. Acheson bored them into submission with brilliance. He demonstrated that MacArthur's plan would have led to a suicidal World War III, while his policy, painful as it was, kept the world alive. By the time he stepped down from the chair, the calls for his impeachment had quieted. He hadn't won their love, but he had commanded their respect. He had proven that the primitives could be defeated by a superior mind. The war in Korea ground on, turning into a bloody stalemate along the 38th parallel, the very place it had started. It was a frustrating, unpopular war of attrition. But while the public looked at the mud of Korea, Acheson was quietly securing the future of Europe. In 1952, amidst the gloom of the war, Acheson pulled off another diplomatic miracle. He integrated West Germany into the Western defense system. It was a hard sell. The French still hated the Germans, and the British were wary. But Acheson knew that you couldn't defend Europe without German manpower. He forged the agreements that would eventually allow Germany to rearm and join NATO. It was the final pillar of the containment architecture. He had built the wall that the Soviets would never be able to breach. But the clock was running out. The 1952 presidential election was approaching, and the Democrats were doomed. The country was tired of the war, tired of the strikes, and tired of Harry Truman. They wanted a change. They wanted a hero. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the liberator of Europe, accepted the Republican nomination. Acheson watched the campaign with a sense of detachment. He supported the Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson, another intellectual, but he knew the tide was irresistible. Eisenhower promised to go to Korea and end the war. The Republicans campaigned on the slogan K1C2, Korea, Communism, and Corruption. The communism part was a direct arrow aimed at Acheson's heart. In November 1952, Eisenhower won in a landslide. The Truman era was over. The transition period was awkward. Acheson met with his successor, John Foster Dulles, a man Acheson considered a sanctimonious bore. He tried to brief Dulles on the complexities of the world, on the fragile web of alliances he had spun. Dulles, eager to please the Republican base, spoke of rolling back communism, dismissing Acheson's containment as cowardly and immoral. Acheson just smiled his thin, ironic smile. He knew that once Dulles sat in the chair, he would find that rhetoric is easy, but reality is hard. He knew that Dulles would end up following the very policies Acheson had designed simply because there was no other choice. On his final day in office, January 20th, 1953, Dean Acheson cleaned out his desk. He said goodbye to the staff who had served him with fierce loyalty. He walked out of the State Department, the building where he had remade the world. There were no crowds to cheer him. There were no parades. To half the country, he was still a villain. He got into his car and drove away, back to private life, back to the silence. But for a man like Dean Acheson, silence was impossible. He didn't truly retire, he merely moved his command center. For the next decade, strictly as a private citizen, he transformed into the shadow king of Washington. The wise elder presidents called when the world was on fire, and they were out of options. In October 1962, the world held its breath. Russian nuclear missiles were in Cuba. In the White House Situation Room, amidst terrified advisors, Acheson was the voice of cold steel. He demanded airstrikes. He wanted to smash the Soviets. When JFK chose a blockade instead, he needed Acheson for the most impossible mission of all, convincing General Charles de Gaulle of France, a man who trusted no one. The showdown at the Élysée Palace was legendary. Acheson walked in not as a messenger, but as the embodiment of American power. He told de Gaulle that the U.S. was ready to risk World War III. He reached into his briefcase to pull out the spy plane photos, the proof. De Gaulle raised a hand, stopping him cold. The French giant stared at the American aristocrat and asked one question: "Are you here to consult me or to inform me?" Acheson didn't blink. He replied with icy precision, "I am here to inform you of the decision of the President of the United States." A silence hung in the room. Then de Gaulle nodded. "I do not need to see your photographs. The word of the President is good enough for me." It was a masterclass in dominance. Acheson had secured the Western Front with sheer personality. But his most devastating act was yet to come. Lyndon Johnson worshipped Acheson. He dragged the old lion back to the White House to bless the Vietnam War. For years, Acheson was a hawk, urging the president to kill more, bomb more. But in 1968, after the Tet Offensive, the facts changed, and Dean Acheson served only one God, the truth. He went to the Pentagon. He grilled the generals. He looked at the raw data and saw the horror. The war was a lie. On March 25, 1968, the wise men gathered. LBJ looked at Acheson, desperate for hope. Instead, Acheson pulled the trigger. "Mr. President," Acheson said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife, "the Joint Chiefs have no plan. The war is not winnable. You are destroying the country for nothing." It was a political execution. Johnson sat stunned. The man he respected most had just told him it was over. 5 days later, a broken Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. Acheson had single-handedly brought down a presidency. His work was done. On a quiet autumn Tuesday in 1971, Dean Acheson sat at his desk in Maryland. He slumped forward, dying instantly amongst his papers. He wasn't a saint. He was an arrogant elitist who played chess with human lives. But look at the world today. The alliances, the institutions, the very air we breathe in the West. It is the air Dean Acheson oxygenated. He found a world in ashes, and he built a fortress that still stands. He was the gentleman who looked the devil in the eye and never blinked.